Tariffs don't cause inflation, they cause success. They cause big success. So we're going to have great success.
On the 30th of June 1932, the Irish government, as it had threatened since it was formed a few months beforehand, defaulted on £1.5 million worth of financial obligations to the United Kingdom. To recoup these losses, the British government imposed 20% duties on the majority of Irish agricultural imports, and in retaliation, the Irish government imposed duties on British imports such as coal and steel. The economic war had begun. By the time it ended in 1938, Éamon de Valera would have redrawn the Irish constitution, irrevocably altered Ireland's relationship with Britain and its place within the Commonwealth, and crushed his political enemies, ushering in 3/4 of a century of Fianna Fáil electoral dominance. Some consider this to be de Valera's greatest hour, winning major financial and political concessions from Britain, while others believe his actions drove immigration and held back Irish economic development for decades. To fully understand the impact of the economic war and its outcomes, we'll first have to take a look at one of its major causes, the land annuities. By the 1800s, following centuries of English conquest and land confiscation, around 80% of the land was owned by less than 20% of the population. Most of the Irish population lived in abject poverty, on small plots rented from absentee landlords, and for many, the potato was the only crop they could grow in sufficient quantities for survival. These conditions resulted in the devastation of the Great Hunger, in which 1 million people died and 2 million immigrated, sparking off a population decline that would continue for 120 years. In its aftermath, agricultural output grew as small holdings were consolidated by large farmers to raise cattle, but this drove competition for land amongst the poor, and in the West, most were still dependent on the potato. Agrarian violence and calls for land reform were widespread. In 1881, to undercut Charles Stewart Parnell's growing support and quell the violence of the land war, the British government passed a Land Act which facilitated tenants purchasing land from their landlords. 3/4 of the funds required were put forward by the newly established Land Commission, to be repaid over a 35-year period with interest. These were the first of the land annuities. Between 1891 and 1909, a number of other Land Acts transferred 11 million acres of land to tenants with the goal of pacifying Ireland and killing Home Rule with kindness, and while they may have achieved the latter goal, they failed on the former. Land reform was suspended during the First World War, sparking off waves of agrarian violence against ranchers and large farmers, and some of the most active regions during the Irish Revolution were those in which demand for land was highest. While the Government of Ireland Act allowed the newly created Northern and Southern Parliaments to retain their land annuities, a financial agreement signed before the end of the Civil War stipulated that the Irish Free State would collect and pay the annuities in their jurisdiction to the British government, and imposed a number of other financial obligations, such as paying 75% of ex-civil servant pensions. This agreement was never presented to the Dáil, however, nor was the ultimate financial settlement of 1926, one of 2 such agreements signed in the aftermath of the Boundary Commission debacle. These provided the Free State government with a debt write-off to save face and reiterated that it would collect and pay the land annuities to the British government. But the drop in agricultural prices following the World War and the disruption to annuity payments during the Irish Revolution meant that many farmers were in arrears by this stage, and calls grew for the payments to be withheld. The campaign was driven by Peadar O'Donnell, Sinn Féin TD for Donegal and editor of the party's paper, An Phoblacht, and he'd be arrested in March of 1927 for inciting farmers not to pay. The Cumann Gael government, led by W.T. Cosgrave, insisted that the annuities had to be paid in full to maintain the state's trustworthiness and international credit rating. O'Donnell's arrest and acquittal focused public attention on annuity payments and made it an important issue during the general election, called for June of 1927. But it would be a new, though familiar, political figure that would benefit most from the campaign. Following the defeat of the anti-treaty forces he had nominally led during the Irish Civil War, most would have considered the political career of Éamon de Valera to be over. Once hailed as President of the Irish Republic, he now led a Sinn Féin party committed to abstaining from Dáil Éireann, giving Cumann Gael an uncontested majority. De Valera strained against this policy, and in 1926 he left Sinn Féin to establish Fianna Fáil, which advocated retaining the £3 million in annuity payments and investing the money in Irish agriculture. 44 Fianna Fáil TDs were elected in June of 1927, just 3 short of Cumann Gael, and when they eventually took their seats, they backed the Labour Party to form a new government, which was defeated by only a single vote. Gael called another general election within a few weeks, consolidating their power, while Fianna Fáil grew further at the expense of Labour and Sinn Féin. This division would define Irish politics for the next 97 years. When a general election was called in January of 1932, Gael believed its record would see it through, but Fianna Fáil gained substantially, becoming the largest party in the state, and with the support of Labour, de Valera was elected President of the Executive Council, 10 years after resigning as President of the Irish Republic. The news of de Valera's return was met with utter dismay in London. As far as the British government was concerned, the signing of the Anglo-Irish Treaty and the victory of its supporters in the ensuing civil war had settled the Irish question once and for all. The decade after the treaty had seen major Commonwealth reform, granting its members, bound by allegiance to the British Crown, equal status with the United Kingdom. In 1931, when the Statute of Westminster removed the British Parliament's powers to legislate for the Dominions, the government considered excluding the Irish Free State, as it would allow them to repeal the treaty. But Cosgrave assured them that changes would only be made with the consent of both parliaments, and Ireland's exclusion would have angered the other Dominions, showing that a two-tier system still existed. A year later, as the British had feared when he was elected, de Valera began the unilateral destruction of the treaty, starting with the oath. When the Articles of Agreement, signed on the 6th of December 1921, were brought back to Dublin, the most divisive aspect was the oath. De Valera had urged the Irish delegates to push for external association, a vague and nebulous concept where Ireland would remain outside, but associated with, the Commonwealth, recognising King George V as head of the association, but not the head of the Irish state. To the British delegates, such a concept was rank heresy. They insisted on an explicit oath of allegiance to the Crown, but Michael Collins was able to talk them down to wording in which elected officials would swear allegiance to the Irish Constitution and fidelity to the monarch as head of state. This compromise text was still unacceptable to a significant minority within the Dáil, which narrowly approved the treaty, and the Irish Republican Army split into opposing factions, setting the stage for the Irish Civil War. Following the defeat of the anti-treaty forces, Sinn Féin refused to take their seats in the Dáil over the oath, and when de Valera left to found Fianna Fáil, it still presented a major hurdle. After the 1927 election, they initially refused to enter the Dáil, but when the Minister for Justice, Kevin O'Higgins, was assassinated a month later, legislation was introduced that would require candidates for election to pledge to take the oath. This forced de Valera's hand and led him to enter in August. When presented with the members' book containing the oath, he covered the text with a sheet of paper, signed his name at the bottom, and swore he would see the book destroyed. On the 22nd of March 1932, just 13 days after the formation of the new Fianna Fáil government, John Delanty, the Irish High Commissioner to the United Kingdom, informed the Dominions Office that de Valera had a mandate to abolish the oath, that it was unnecessary under the treaty, and that its removal was a purely domestic affair. And back in Dublin, de Valera announced that he would also withhold the land annuity instalment due on the 30th of June. J.H. Thomas, the Dominion Secretary and a member of the Irish Situation Committee set up following de Valera's election, responded that the oath was mandatory under the treaty and that Ireland was obliged to pay the annuities under the 1923 and 26 financial agreements. While only the headings of the 26 settlement had been presented to the Dáil, this was the first de Valera had ever heard of an earlier agreement. A search of the Department of Finance files returned only an unsigned draft, and as the agreement had never been ratified by the Dáil, de Valera insisted that his government was not bound by it. By April, de Valera had also raised questions over the treaty ports which had been retained by Britain, and Ireland's other financial obligations, which, added to the annuities, represented yearly payments totalling £5.3 million. Even the temporary disruption of these payments would have put pressure on the British Treasury, and the Irish Situation Committee began to consider imposing tariffs on Irish imports if the payments were withheld. The strongest calls for sanctions against a recalcitrant Ireland came from Gael. They believed that severe economic penalties would break Labour's support for the Fianna Fáil government, bringing them down and returning Cosgrave to power. The party was put on the back foot, however, when de Valera introduced a bill to remove the oath on the 20th of April. Even those who had voted in favour of the treaty despised the oath, but considered it a bitter pill that had to be choked down for Ireland to achieve self-determination. Gael offered muted opposition on the consequences of removing the oath, but it passed all stages with Labour support and was then sent to the Senate. There it was passed, but with amendments which the government refused to sign off on. This effectively delayed the bill for up to 18 months, after which the original wording would be passed automatically if sent again. But before then, events would have changed dramatically. A deal allowing the exports of Commonwealth dominions to enter the United Kingdom tariff-free was about to run up in November, and a conference to renegotiate trade policy was to be held in Ottawa in July. On the 11th of May, just before the Oath Removal Bill was sent to the Senate, the Dominion Secretary Thomas stated that if it became law, the Irish government would have broken its obligation to uphold the treaty, and it would be unreasonable to expect the British government to enter into negotiations on future agreements with them. Failure to agree a new trade policy in Ottawa would see Irish agricultural goods lose their preferential treatment in the British market and the imposition of tariffs come November. On the 7th of June, Thomas and the Secretary of War, Lord Hailsham, arrived in Dublin at De Valera's invitation, and a few days later he made a return visit to London for an acrimonious meeting with the Prime Minister, Ramsay MacDonald, entering Downing Street for the first time in 11 years. These talks went nowhere. The British, especially Thomas, wanted a single settlement covering just the oath and annuities, while De Valera argued that a long-term solution would require an end to partition and recognition of Ireland as a republic in association with the Commonwealth. Basically, the same suggestions the British had rejected out of hand in 1921. Thomas would describe De Valera after as a complete dreamer with no grasp of realities. On the 1st of July, the Financial Secretary to the Treasury, Walter Elliott, confirmed in the House of Commons that the £1.5 million instalment of the Irish land annuities due the previous day had not been paid. Thomas urged that hefty penalties be applied to Irish imports, as he was convinced De Valera would be defeated in the next election, and that any concessions to him now would bolster his party and weaken Cumlaghoil's prospects of returning to office. Other British officials were less certain that De Valera would be ousted, and that he would claim the sanctions were an attack on Irish sovereignty. British goods were treated more favourably in the Irish market than in other dominions, and if De Valera was re-elected, what was intended as a short economic shock to destabilise his government could turn into a lengthy disruption of trade. It would be Thomas's arguments that would win out, and on the 14th of July the Special Duties Act came into force, applying a 20% duty on live animals for food, animals not for food, butter, cream, eggs, bacon, pork, poultry, game, and other meat of all kinds. Separate from this, if an agreement wasn't reached on trade policy at Ottawa, some of these goods would be hit with another round of duties. De Valera arrived in London for talks with Ramsay MacDonald the next evening, but the meeting turned sour and broke down over the terms of an arbitration tribunal. As De Valera left, MacDonald said he hoped to see him again soon. De Valera responded, "I don't think so." A week later, on the 22nd of July, the Irish government passed the Emergency Imposition of Duties Act. British coal would be hit with a duty of 5 shillings per tonne and 20% duties imposed on cement, electrical machinery, iron, steel and sugar. In the face of these duties and failures to agree to arbitration, talks between British and Irish delegates at the Ottawa Conference broke down. The pain was quickly felt on both sides. Irish exports to Britain, which accounted for a staggering 96.3% of all Irish exports, fell from £14 to £9 million in a single year, while coalfields, the length and breadth of the United Kingdom, already suffering as a result of the Great Depression, had to scale back operations, implement short time and let miners go. Another divisive conference was held in London in October, which was doomed from the very start. The British delegation, including Thomas and Neville Chamberlain, but not MacDonald, who was ill, wanted to deal only with the annuities and re-establishing the status quo on trade, while De Valera had submitted memoranda covering RIC and civil service pensions, local loans, and claims of overtaxation under the Union. The breakdown of this meeting was followed by the implementation of additional duties on Irish goods following the failure of the Ottawa Conference, and to compound matters for De Valera, he was now faced with a constitutional crisis. The previous April, the Minister for Defence, Frank Aiken, and the Vice President of the Executive Council, Sean T. O'Kelly, had walked out of an event held at the French delegation on the arrival of the King's representative in Ireland, the Governor-General, James McNeill. Further snubs by the government at the Eucharistic Congress led McNeill to write to De Valera demanding an apology, but when this wasn't forthcoming, he sent their correspondence to the British and Irish media, where it was published. With duties bills passing through both parliaments, De Valera had other concerns, but in September he wrote to King George V requesting McNeill's resignation, citing his publication of their correspondence as the reason. The king and his officials were sympathetic to McNeill, who was to resign in February anyway, but they agreed that his friend Delanty should travel to Dublin and convince him to step down to avoid further controversy. After initially refusing, in early October, McNeill agreed to depart if he could offer his resignation in person to the king, which he was allowed to do at a luncheon at Buckingham Palace. De Valera now had to nominate McNeill's successor, and he initially attempted to force the job onto the Chief Justice, Hugh Kennedy, but having helped draft the Irish Free State Constitution, Kennedy wanted nothing to do with dismantling it. He then suggested himself, but the British Attorney General told De Valera that he couldn't take the position as it would contravene both the Anglo-Irish Treaty and the Constitution. Further attempts were made to cajole and threaten Kennedy, but on the 24th of November, De Valera was forced to act. As predicted by McCullagh and the Irish Situation Committee, Labour's support for Fianna Fáil was beginning to waver. If he could control the timing of an election, De Valera was certain that he could win, but to dissolve the Dáil he would need the signature of the Governor-General. De Valera scoured the ranks of Fianna Fáil for an acceptable candidate, and wrote to King George V, nominating Donal O'Buchala for the position. At De Valera's behest, O'Buchala lived in a suburban house in South Dublin instead of moving into the Viceregal Lodge, avoided attending state events, and received the credentials of only one foreign ambassador before De Valera had the task transferred to himself. The position of Governor-General was another aspect of the treaty disagreeable to De Valera, but he hadn't campaigned on its removal and seemed ill-prepared for the crisis that arose. He was overconfident when he moved against McNeill that he could appoint himself or the Chief Justice in his place, and was eventually forced to comply with the Constitution to stave off an electoral disaster. His appointment of O'Buchala is often presented as a masterstroke calculated to embarrass the king to such a degree that no objection was put forward when the position was later abolished, but in reality it was a happy accident that surprised De Valera as much as it did his opponents. As the economic war worsened, so too did the stability of the Irish government. Unemployment had jumped from 30,000 in March to 80,000 by October, and the government had put down a motion criticising its course of action by just 5 votes in November, showing that Labour support was at breaking point. After the failure to agree a trade deal at the Ottawa Conference, there was even rumours of dissension within the ranks of the cabinet itself, and McCullagh had begun coalition talks with the new Centre Party. It was clear that an election was on the horizon, but no one was prepared when, on the 3rd of January 1933, O'Buchala dissolved the Dáil on De Valera's instructions and called a general election for the 24th. De Valera's campaign focused on sovereignty and Anglo-Irish relations, calling for a strong mandate that would silence his critics and allow him to move against the Senate, which stood in the way of his wider plans. Commonwealth were confident that the 9 months of chaos De Valera had unleashed on the country would see them return to power, though their stance for retaining the oath had weakened and they were beginning to support withholding the annuities. The British government had no official representatives in Ireland at this time, and were dependent on a hodgepodge of Southern Unionists and private British citizens for news, including Lord Middleton and a future Derby-winning jockey. On the eve of the election, Conservative MP Sir Ralph Glynn informed MacDonald that his contacts in Dublin believed Cosgrave would be returned with a surprising majority. The results were beyond their worst nightmares. When the Dáil reconvened on the 8th of February, Fianna Fáil was able to elect the Ceann Comhairle, after which it was just 1 seat short of an absolute majority. Labour's vote had fallen, but they actually gained a seat as a result of transfers from Fianna Fáil. They accepted that the people had given De Valera a resounding mandate to do whatever the hell he wanted, and agreed to facilitate the formation of a minority government, until 2 by-election victories in 1936 allowed him to rule without the need for opposition support. The re-election of the government allowed De Valera to circumvent the 18-month waiting period holding up the Oath Removal Bill. The original text was sent to the Senate again in March and passed without a vote on the 3rd of May. The British government view was that, while the removal was a clear breach of the treaty, it did not affect the duty of allegiance, nor did it amount to secession from the Commonwealth. Throughout 1933, a number of government officials and non-government contacts travelled to London for meetings, claiming they did so with De Valera's approval, but not his authority. a formula that allowed him to both distance himself from and retain absolute control over the Irish side of the proceedings. The proposals presented to the British made it clear to them that De Valera was trying to turn the clock back to 1921 and renegotiate the entire Anglo-Irish treaty. Instead of dealing with any of these issues, they held out for a change of government, and a new presence on the scene gave them hopes for optimism. Sir Ralph Glynn may have been wrong on the 1933 election, but he now reported that De Valera's actions had led to the emergence of a white army, more numerous than the IRA, and recruited from a far better class of person. Better known as the Blue Shirts, Glynn's White Army had recruited Eoin O'Duffy as their new leader after he was removed as Garda Commissioner by Fianna Fáil in February of 1933. Though he would most likely have been sacked by Cumann Gael had they been returned to power, back-to-back electoral defeats left the party reeling, and when they merged with the Centre Party to form Fine Gael, O'Duffy was invited to become its first leader. I've covered O'Duffy's rise, De Valera's fears of a Mussolini-style march on Dublin, and the legal battles waged by him against the Blue Shirts in another video. But with local elections approaching in June of 1934, the British hoped that O'Duffy would succeed where Cosgrave had failed. O'Duffy confidently predicted that his party would win 20 of the 23 councils being contested. Instead, they won just 7, with the remainder going to a Fianna Fáil Labour coalition. It was now made clear to the British that De Valera was going nowhere, and his party was more popular than ever.
And by the way, for years they knocked the word tariff, properly used, is a beautiful word. One of the most beautiful words.
Since taking office, Fianna Fáil had implemented a wide-ranging tariff programme to counter the effects of the Great Depression and promote self-sufficiency. Hefty tariffs were placed on food imports in a bid to encourage farmers to use land for tillage instead of cattle grazing, and tariffs were placed on goods like shoes to support native manufacturers and prevent the dumping of cheap products onto the Irish market. Tariffs were also used to attract foreign industry. A 100% tariff on shoelaces was implemented to support the setting up of a factory which would employ 200 people in Ennis. A number of British companies established Irish branches to get around these tariffs. Cadbury opened a plant in Dublin in 1932, and Dunlop opened a factory in Cork in 1934, enticed by a licence to supply 80% of the state's tyre needs. De Valera's industrialisation campaign had limited results and did little to reverse immigration or solve the unemployment crisis, but it did solidify Fianna Fáil's electoral support in Dublin, where many of the new industries were set up. Large and medium-sized cattle farmers most impacted by the economic war tended to vote Fine Gael, and small farmers benefited from social welfare payments introduced by Fianna Fáil, which included free meat when the calf slaughter scheme began in March of 1934. In Britain, the sanctions that they had imposed on Irish imports were beginning to cause them trouble. They were too effective. The price of Irish cattle had collapsed on the British market, but the Irish government tried to mitigate this somewhat by providing farmers with bounties. Irish exports under British duties were thus higher than they would have been otherwise, more than offsetting the lost annuity payments. The British Treasury actually rejected plans to impose further duties as, without corresponding Irish bounties, their revenue would decrease. Britain would never be able to recover the export revenue lost from companies setting up in Ireland to get around its tariffs, and there was now a fear that long-term damage to the Irish economy would see a permanent decline in exports to a country that was still one of its best customers. The coal situation was especially worrying. Weekly exports to Ireland had fallen from 45,000 tonnes in 1931 to 20,000 tonnes by the start of 1934, and a Welsh MP said that 5,000 men had become unemployed as a result of the dispute. Talks of a limited trade deal had been flouted since early 1933, but unofficial overtures to De Valera in May of 34 were dropped by Thomas, likely because he was hoping for a Fine Gael victory in the June local elections. In October, however, came the shocking news that Ireland was on the verge of signing a trade deal with Germany to secure a supply of coal. German coal contained more sulphur than British coal, and Irish trains would need to undergo expensive alterations to use it, effectively ruling out a resumption of British trade. Delaunty made it seem like it was a done deal, but the talks had actually largely broken down. Nevertheless, the British were frightened into action, and in December the Coal Cattle Pact was agreed, announced on the 3rd of January 1935, in which Britain would take more Irish cattle and Ireland would purchase more British coal. The Coal Cattle Pact was an admittance of failure by the British in the face of De Valera's continued constitutional crusade, and any hopes he could be stopped were shattered when he took on the Privy Council. The right to appeal the findings of Irish courts to the Privy Council, made up of advisers appointed by the King, was massively unpopular in Ireland. Arthur Griffith had tried to block its inclusion in the Anglo-Irish Treaty, Michael Collins had left it out of his first, rejected draft of the Free State Constitution, and Cosgrave had called for it to be removed at imperial conferences in 1926 and 1930. When the Statute of Westminster was introduced, he started drafting legislation to do so, but was dumped out of office before he could implement it. The honour was thus left to De Valera, who abolished the right to appeal on the 15th of November 1933. But a bizarre case centering on fishing rights on the Donegal River, which hinged on the interpretation of the Magna Carta and Brehon Law, had already been appealed to the Privy Council. De Valera denied that they now had any right to hear the case and refused to send legal representatives. So, when the delayed hearings finally opened in London in April of 1935, it became a one-sided trial of the legality of his constitutional changes. Legal experts, including the Attorney General Thomas Inskip, argued that the treaty imposed moral and contractual obligations on the Irish government, and that legislative acts which were repugnant to the treaty were outside the competence of the Oireachtas. But when they published their report on the 6th of June, the Privy Council agreed that the Statute of Westminster gave De Valera the power to repeal the treaty. While De Valera was vindicated, some of the arguments put forward caused him unease, and he ordered the legal adviser of the Department of External Affairs to begin drawing up the heads of a new constitution. Since De Valera's election, J.H. Thomas had seen himself as a defender of the empire against a man described as a lunatic and a fanatic. He claimed to be the first minister ever to stand up to the objectionable behaviour of the Irish, but wavered between severe action and compromise, and largely based Dominion office policy on the hopes that Cosgrave would return to power. He was accused of causing a loss of British prestige as a result of the economic war, and calls grew for him to be sacked after the Privy Council report. When a general election on the 14th of November 1935 returned the outgoing Conservative National Labour coalition, Thomas was moved to the Colonial Office and replaced by his Under-Secretary Malcolm MacDonald, son of the former Prime Minister. On his departure, the De Valera-controlled Irish press hailed Thomas as a conspicuous failure. The Coal Cattle Pact was renewed before the November election, seeing both sides reduce duties on a wide range of imports, and the growing world crisis made the need for a full settlement more pressing. In March of 1936, Adolf Hitler had ordered German troops into the Rhineland, breaching the Treaty of Versailles, and in May, Italy annexed Ethiopia. That same month, MacDonald submitted a report to the Cabinet which reviewed the whole dispute with Ireland since 1932 and outlined what would be required of a general settlement. The main point was that the Free State would have to remain within the Commonwealth, which would require them to maintain the King for internal and external affairs. The annuities would be cancelled with a one-off lump sum payment, and the return of the treaty ports would be examined. MacDonald urged that negotiations should begin as soon as possible, but was caught completely by surprise on the 10th of June when De Valera had Delanty give him an outline of his new constitution. It would leave external affairs untouched, but for internal matters it created the office of President and abolished completely that of Governor-General. De Valera argued that his proposed new constitution was consistent with Commonwealth membership. He had already removed the Oath of Allegiance and most of the powers of the Governor-General, but still Ireland remained. The British now had to assess core aspects of what membership entailed, and agreed that a country that recognised the King as head of the Commonwealth was more than a foreign country. Issues that the British believed had been settled in 1921 with threats of terrible and immediate war were now back with a vengeance, and De Valera's position would soon be strengthened with a bit of help from the new monarch. On the 4th of December, MacDonald informed De Valera that King Edward VIII, only on the throne since January, would abdicate to marry an American divorcee. This would require the Dáil to convene and pass a bill explicitly recognising that Edward was no longer king and that his brother George had succeeded him. This didn't appeal to De Valera, and he initially planned to ignore the crisis, until he was told that doing so would mean Edward remained king of the Free State, with Wallis Simpson becoming queen after they married. Just a few days later, on the 10th, De Valera rapidly sped up plans that had been in development for the past few months. he introduced an amendment that removed all reference to the Crown from the Free State Constitution and gutted what few powers the Governor-General still retained. The amendment was forced through the Dáil in a single day, using a procedure called the guillotine, and it would then have gone on to the Senate, where it could have been delayed for up to 18 months, if De Valera hadn't abolished the Senate earlier in the year after they delayed powers he needed to fight the Blue Shirts. The following day, the guillotine was used again to force through the External Relations Act. This recognised the abdication and, in extremely obtuse language, accepted the accession of George VI, without actually mentioning him by name. The new king's powers in the Free State would be severely limited, however. He would serve only as a constitutional organ for the purpose of appointing Irish diplomatic representatives and concluding international agreements, both on the advice of the government. 15 years after it had been rejected in the treaty negotiations, which then sparked off a civil war, De Valera had made manifest a slightly watered-down version of external association. The Irish Situation Committee spent the next few months trying to adjust to the new situation. De Valera had shredded every single stipulation that they had mandated for Commonwealth membership, but had steadfastly refused to declare a republic in the face of pressure from the IRA, members of his own party, and even Fine Gael, calling it a sacrifice that was needed to end partition. If the British were to eject Ireland for these breaches, they would be denounced by the other dominions, and would potentially set up a hostile nation on their doorstep amidst a worsening global situation. Then, in May, De Valera introduced his new constitution, Bunreacht na hÉireann, which made no mention of the Crown or the Commonwealth, renamed the country simply to Ireland, and declared the national territory to consist of the whole island. The constitution was rushed through the Dáil in just a few weeks and put to the people alongside a general election on the 1st of July. This was the perfect opportunity for an electorate suffering under a disastrous economic war to deliver a message to De Valera and punish him for refighting arguments he had lost over a decade and a half ago. Fianna Fáil lost 8 TDs, while Fine Gael lost 11. Just 2 seats short of a majority, Fianna Fáil were able to continue on with the support of Labour. The constitution was narrowly approved with 56% of the vote, which De Valera felt was due to the way that he had rushed it through. As the constitution was being hurriedly debated, Stanley Baldwin had stepped down as Prime Minister of the United Kingdom and was replaced by Neville Chamberlain. He is considered to have been the strongest Prime Minister since Gladstone, giving him the ability to deal with Ireland in a decisive and fair fashion, which Lloyd George couldn't in 1921. At meetings in Geneva in September for the League of Nations and in London the following month, De Valera and MacDonald began to discuss methods of bringing the trade dispute to an end, which mostly centred around defence and on the ports, now that De Valera considered the constitutional question definitively dealt with. The economic situation in Ireland was beginning to deteriorate, and Fianna Fáil was again dependent on the support of a critical Labour Party to retain power. De Valera was also fearful of the global situation and, like most other small nations, was determined that Ireland would remain neutral if another world war began. Informal discussions continued for a few months before it was decided that negotiations would begin on the 17th of January 1938 to bring the economic war to an end. The Irish delegation that travelled to London consisted of De Valera, the Minister for Industry and Commerce, Sean Lemass, the Minister for Finance, Sean McEntee, and the Minister for Agriculture, Dr. James Ryan. De Valera dominated, however, and Lemass noted that if the other delegates had contributions to make, they wrote them on a sheet of paper and passed them to him. This would be De Valera's first negotiation with major British figures, including the Prime Minister, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, and MacDonald, since 1921. Talks continued on and off amidst various crises such as the resignation of Anthony Eden over 3 rounds, with the guidelines proposed by MacDonald 2 years beforehand largely guiding the British. The total outstanding capitalisation of the land annuities and other payments was £100 million, and it was decided to settle this with a lump sum payment. The Treasury initially pushed for a settlement of £37 million, while Irish Finance Department officials started as low as £2 million. Chamberlain, working off an analysis of what the Irish could feasibly borrow, had already settled on £10 million, which was put forward and agreed by both sides. While retaliatory duties would be lifted by both countries, the loss of companies to Ireland and the increase in industrialisation there during the economic war saw the British Treasury demand some form of compensation. Agreement was reached that a tariff commission would be set up which would review prices and ensure fair competitive terms for British goods in the Irish market, though it would rarely actually do so. Certain British goods were to be given preference, and a duty was to be imposed on non-British coal entering the Irish market. Throughout the negotiations, De Valera had attempted to link the agreement of a defence policy to the ending of partition, almost collapsing the talks on the issue, but Chamberlain undercut him by offering to return the treaty ports without obligation. The Chiefs of Staff considered the ports to be of limited value, and with a global conflict on the horizon, no effort should be spared to ensure that friendly relations with Ireland are maintained. Trade with Northern Ireland became a major sticking point. Stormont had sent delegates to London at the start of the talks, but refused to meet with the Irish, and pushed Chamberlain to secure free entry of goods to the Irish market. Lemass was prepared to lift tariffs on some goods produced in Northern Ireland, but opposed free entry, as it would undermine new Irish industries. De Valera told Chamberlain that substantial concessions to Northern Ireland would never make it through the Dáil, and the British had to purchase Unionist support with promises of defence contracts. With this last issue settled, the economic war was over. When the Anglo-Irish trade agreement was signed on the 25th of April 1938, De Valera was presented with the field binoculars that had been taken from him following his surrender to British forces in 1916. Contemptuous of the secret agreements made in 23 and 26, De Valera had enshrined in the Constitution a clause that every international agreement which involved the state would have to be put to the Dáil, and on the 29th it was approved with only a single dissenting voice, that of Jim Larkin. A month later, while De Valera was attending the funeral of his uncle, the government was defeated by a single vote on a motion before the Dáil, and this was used as a pretence to call a general election. After all the anarchy of the economic war, Fianna Fáil would be returned with 52% of the first preference vote and an absolute majority in the Dáil. It would be 10 more years before De Valera would briefly be removed from power. It's hard to view the economic war as anything other than a staggering victory for De Valera and his single-minded quest for constitutional reform. Driven by an overwhelming self-confidence in the justice of his cause, verging on sheer delusion, he was fully prepared to see the Irish cattle market wiped out to achieve his goals, in the face of opposition from his own cabinet, the wider Fianna Fáil party, the regular Republican paramilitary, a shirted para-fascist paramilitary, and the might of the British economy. The electorate was given 3 opportunities to scream stop, but instead gave him mandates, and more often than not absolute majorities, that allowed him to intensify his campaign. In the end, De Valera shredded the agreement Michael Collins and Arthur Griffith had signed in 1921 and reshaped Ireland's constitutional relationship with Britain and the Commonwealth on his own terms. Much of what he achieved, however, was thanks to the Statutes of Westminster. Though De Valera insisted that he was operating only on Irish law and never actually invoked them, the statutes severely hampered the British cabinet's ability to respond coherently to the crisis he created. They hoped trade sanctions would knock some sense into the Irish people and restore the more favourable Cosgrave to power, but the insistence of linking the massively unpopular oath and financial matters allowed De Valera to present himself as a defender of Irish sovereignty. The return of the treaty ports, arguably the greatest achievement of his entire career, was more the result of British needs to secure a friendly neighbour than De Valera's skills as a negotiator. His determination to link defence policy to a British commitment to end partition saw him threaten to break talks when offered the ports, and his complaints over the cost required to maintain them led Chamberlain to comment sarcastically that he would hate to inflict such a burden onto the Irish and threaten to withhold them. De Valera can take credit for wearing the British down so much that Chamberlain eventually handed over the ports without any firm promise that Britain could use them in a time of war. This established full Irish sovereignty over the 26-county state and allowed Ireland to remain neutral during the Second World War. De Valera's prosecution of the economic war is often blamed for crippling the Irish economy and holding back national development, but it's likely that things would have played out similarly even in the absence of a trade dispute. As a result of the Great Depression, Britain had already started implementing tariffs before De Valera came to power, and there was a glut of agricultural products on the global market, which had an adverse effect on any economy dependent on the industry, such as Ireland. Denmark, for example, signed a deal in 1933 to import 80% of its coal needs from Britain, but saw a severe fall in the value of its agricultural exports in the opposite direction. The return of the treaty ports and the cancellation of the annuities payments, which would have placed a burden on the state for decades to come, greatly outweighed the loss in export revenue during the economic war. So while his tariff policies in the 30s actually helped Ireland mitigate the worst of the Great Depression, earning the approval of modern historians and economists, it was De Valera's reluctance to budge from this position in the face of changing global conditions that would hamper Irish economic development into the late 1950s, when he would finally hand over the reins to Sean Lemass. De Valera's victory was also largely political though, as any dreams of breaking Ireland's dependence on the British market or implementing intensive self-sufficiency were abandoned in 1938. This victory can also largely be attributed to the underdeveloped nature of the Irish economy, which was still recovering after centuries of English and British misrule. For a majority of the population, living standards were already low and actually improved slightly in the 1930s due to social welfare payments introduced by Fianna Fáil and new jobs created in the industrialisation drive. This makes the Anglo-Irish economic war an anomaly amidst the upheaval of the time, and a modern trade war fought by developed nations in a highly interconnected global market would be a totally different matter, imposing severe damage on all sides. Let's hope nobody gets it into their head to start one. In 1922, Éamon de Valera had rejected the claims of Michael Collins that the treaty would serve as a stepping stone to full Irish independence. 15 years and a civil war later, insisting that he was operating only within Irish law, de Valera's piecemeal destruction of the treaty seemed to justify Collins's position. During the negotiations that led to the Anglo-Irish trade agreement, de Valera's charm and ability to exhaust his opponents with lengthy speeches on matters legal, political and historical won major concessions, calling into question his decision to stay away from the 1921 talks. Next, as I continue to examine the life and impact of Éamon de Valera 50 years on from his death, I look at the events surrounding the Anglo-Irish treaty negotiations and the controversial decisions that he made. Check the description for ways to support the channel and subscribe to be notified of shorts and podcast episodes I'll be putting up covering aspects of the economic war I had to cut out. Thank you for joining me on this episode, and until next time, please remember to burn everything British but their coal.